Victoria Bassetti, Senior Advisor of States United Action, author of Electoral Dysfunction, which is amazing, a survival manual for American voters. Victoria, thanks so much for taking the time to come on today.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Well, it's necessary here because the midterms are less than a week away. My anxiety levels about it continue to climb. And your guys' project at States United Action has two really useful tools that people can use if they want to see there are election deniers on their ballot, plus also what's happening with their state legislatures and their attempts to overturn democracy as well. But let's start with the replacing the refs tracker, the election deniers on the ballot here. How did you guys decide on making this a priority, and when did you realize that there were going to be so many election deniers on the ballot this midterm cycle that you needed a tracker to just at the very least inform people?
We need multiple Excel spreadsheets to keep track of this. It all actually started more than a year ago when in 2021 we were hearing all sorts of reports and what we were hearing, two things. The first is we were hearing clear efforts by leading politicians and personalities, if you will, in the election denying community, calling on people to run for offices. And then we were hearing people saying, kind of on the ground, local, people in the democracy community saying that they were seeing people running for these posts. And, in some cases it was like county commissioners or, election judges. So we just kind of started with a really small experiment in Pennsylvania. We pulled up the names of a bunch of people who were running for offices in a few counties, and all of a sudden started finding people who were kind of election deniers running for these offices. We found one person who had chartered multiple buses to January 6th in Washington, D.C. So after that little snapshot that we did, we decided, we really need to step back and take a look at this systematically and nationwide. And so we began a project involving multiple researchers and people who started looking systematically at all of the people who were running for governor, attorney general, and secretary of state throughout the country. And we've been doing that systematically since the beginning of this year. We started with the primaries, and now we're ready for the general this Tuesday. And what we're showing is that there's an election denier running for one of those big three offices in more than 50% of the races in the United States. More than half of Americans are going to be, covered or are in the middle of selecting whether or not an election denier is going to be in charge of their election results in 2024.
I mean, that is a scary statistic. As you guys lay out, 40 states plus DC have races that are going to have an election denier. So chances are, if you're living in the United States, that is that's going to be on your ballot. What are some of the states that are most concerning to you? I mean, Arizona really sticks out to me because all three, Kari Lake running for governor, the AG, and the Secretary of State candidate, all election deniers.
Yeah, so if you take a look at what were the states that were the closest and kind of, on the knife's edge in 2020, and then you map that against 2024, what you would be looking at are Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. So those are the states that, people might want to pay the most attention to, but it doesn't just matter if you were kind of on one of those knife edge states in 2020. It also matters if you're in New York or if you're in Ohio. Wherever you are, you ought to care about this because it really matters for every race along the way. If you're really concerned about the presidential in 2024, those states I named are the ones that you might want to be paying the most attention to. But like I said, it doesn't matter where you are. It matters because kind of selecting an election denier to run your elections is going to have an impact up and down the ballot.
And those states though are unique in the sense that you might expect there to be all election deniers running in, say, Arkansas, but I was taking a look at your tracker and it's like, okay, none, right? I mean, it
Right.
seems
Or Georgia, right?
or Georgia. Well, that's
Right.
an almost unique situation because
Yeah.
their integrity was called into question by Trump, and so the only thing that prevented them from being election deniers, frankly, was their own kind of egos, saving us for the first time in a while, Republican egos. But
I think it's maybe a little bit more than that. We probably ought to give them a little bit more credit than that. They
all right.
showed some real integrity then in 2020.
Yeah, all right, but I'm loath to give Republicans credit, but I'll for the sake for your purposes, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
But what is scary to me is what happens when states that are, as you say, a little bit more in play and could go either way. If there is a resurgence, or not resurgence, but a high turnout of Republicans and people who are motivated MAGA fans, essentially, then that could have so many impacts on the way that those state elections and even federal elections are constructed based on their influence, that we could be seeing a very rapid transition to a deeper red as opposed to like purple states, let alone just the threats of democracy.
Yeah, without necessarily having to put kind of a partisan valence on this, although it's pretty clear that there is a one party that does seem to kind of go this way a little bit more than another. What matters is that we're potentially setting up states where the will of the voters isn't actually respected, or that's the worst case scenario, or a situation where there's chaos and uncertainty and constant doubt about whether or not our democratic system is working. And when you sow that continual level of distrust and doubt, you have democratic systems begin to break apart. Trust and confidence in the way we run our elections is the lifeblood of our democracy. And when you break that apart, you see conflict, you see violence, you see an inability to reach resolution, you see very bad substantive policy outcomes as a result of it. It's frightening to live in a society where you've got election deniers in charge and where they are, kind of systematically undermining the way we run our government, which is the way we try to get along without fighting.
Right. It is also another interesting dynamic that you do see that Lee Zeldin, for example, is an election denier in New York, which is where I live. And he's been riding this kind of tough on crime narrative ahead of the election. And that seems to actually be buoying him to in a much closer race than I think a lot of people anticipated versus Kathy Hochul for governor. Can you talk about that race in particular and the dynamics of his election denial in a state like New York, which is very anti-Trump for the most part, but anything can happen, especially in in a midterm election when there's a Democratic president?
Yeah, so it's sometimes hard to figure out whether or not an election denier is an election denier because they really believe it or because they need to say it in order to rally the troops and to kind of really get a core base to show up and vote out of anger and fear. And, I think it's pretty clear that in a bunch of these races, and you might consider New York to be one of them, you've got a candidate who's really tapping into that, kind of really super, tribal fear-based voting, allegiance to Trump. And New York does have voters who are kind of really, kind of into Trump. You may not think that based on New York City, but even I think Staten Island went for Trump.
Yeah, I've driven through Long Island recently. There are a lot of Trump flags around there.
Right. So kind of signaling allegiance to that by being an election denier is an incredibly important thing that's being done. And so I think that, I think that's to a certain degree what's going on in that case. Also, like I'll put it out there, this is the first time New York has had a woman running for governor. So I wouldn't, put it past, that's kind of a little bit of a factor in the tightening of the race.
Yeah, and also, I mean, I would guess 100% true. Also, the fact that she has not yet been elected herself, which I think creates just a complex stew of dynamics in that race. Can you talk a bit about the Kansas governor's race, because Kansas was kind of in the spotlight given the fact that it was via a ballot initiative. It protected abortion rights, which was a welcome surprise in the wake of the overturning of Roe v. Wade. But there's an election denier on the ballot there.
Yeah, so Kansas, I think, as you know, is an incredibly interesting state. And, there's that really famous book, What's the Matter with Kansas? Or is that the name of the book I'm spacing on?
I do not know. I'm sorry.
So there's a really famous book on Kansas about the way it votes. I think it's by Thomas Frank. And
Matt says, yes, you were right about the title. So there you go.
And Kansas has a long and incredible tradition of progressive politics that kind of arose out of the progressive movement and the kind of progressive farmers in the 1930s. So Kansas is contrary to most people's kind of instinctive belief, a little bit more of a kind of a purple state than you might think, although it's gone awfully red in the last 20 years or so. But they do have a Democratic governor right now, and they've elected Democratic senators in the past. It's maybe a little bit too much Kansas history than you want, but I actually happen to be really fascinated by Kansas, and I've visited.
It's fascinating.
Visited a few times and really liked it. So what's happening in Kansas is you've got a baseline of a kind of a progressive base that's always been and has continued to be present in Kansas that's been in kind of relatively sharp decline over the course of the last 25 years. But the Dobbs decision really kind of just snapped things in that state in a way that was shocking. And you saw a massive surge of young women surging into the electorate, registering and voting right before that referendum in the summer. And so the question that we're going to be seeing in this election is an answer to the question that we're going to be seeing in this election is whether or not the Dobbs decision has hyper motivated the electorate, or whether or not it's actually also changed the electorate. Because in the wake of Dobbs, not just in Kansas, but in a bunch of other states, we've seen a surge of young women registering to vote more.
Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, those were the indicators as well. Yeah,
absolutely. And that is one of the things that makes predicting the outcome of this election very difficult at this stage of the game, because most pollsters model their turnout decisions and their understanding of what an electorate is based upon past practice. And the real question that we're facing in this election is whether or not Dobbs has really significantly changed both turnout and the electorate itself, and whether or not the pollsters are modeling that properly. So, trying to decide what's going on based on the polls right now is a little bit of a dicey proposition.
That is one of the most optimistic things I've heard in recent weeks.
I'm a total optimist.
Well, and it's welcome because that is, I mean, absolutely true. And we saw that with why some of the polls were wrong along the margins when MAGA candidates were running, for example, because they didn't take that into account. But hopefully it breaks the other way this time because those numbers are real, as you say. The influx of female voters who were registering in those states, and it was massive in Kansas. I'm just hoping it carries over to the midterms. Let's touch on Michigan as well because there are 5 election deniers running for those positions, and some of them, their independents don't have a likelihood of winning, but at the very least, there are 3 Republican election deniers, and I should not say independents, but different parties, but 3 Republican independents who are election deniers on the ballot. You have the governor, gubernatorial candidate Tudor Dixon, and then AG and Secretary of State as well. What is some of, in your work, what you've discovered in looking at Michigan in particular?
So people, I'm sure, are familiar with the fact that in 2020, I think it's in the early summer or the late spring of 2020, there were a number of people who were arrested because they had plotted to kidnap and kill the governor of Michigan. And it was driven in part by kind of COVID concerns, but it was also driven by, kind of flat out anti-democratic norms. So in Michigan, it is a complicated state right now. You've got 3 women running on the Democratic side of the ticket for governor, attorney general, and secretary of state who were incredibly strong in the 2020 election in terms of certifying their votes for Joe Biden that year. And Michigan, incidentally, on a vote basis, was pretty much a blowout, effectively, for Joe Biden. I think he won by more than 80,000 votes, which is a pretty substantial margin in that state. Nevertheless, the election denier community has been really strong in that state and has been, kind of very active. Indeed, one of the candidates for the candidate for attorney general in Michigan has been referred for criminal prosecution because there's evidence that he may or may not. It's still obviously TBD. It's just an investigation, but there's evidence that he may have been a significant player in efforts to illegally crack open election machines in that state and improperly analyze them. And so it's sort of, pretty wild. He's like a super election denier. He's not a denier. He's also an election denier actor. And so he's one of the guys who's running. I think all of the polls at this stage of the game do indicate that the 3 non-election denier candidates, Gretchen Whitmer for governor, Dana Nessel for attorney general, and Jocelyn Benson for secretary of state are ahead in all of their races. But the election denier gene is strong in Michigan.
Right. And it's just something to kind of keep your eye on because they have many lives, some of the anti-democratic candidates.
Yeah, Jocelyn Benson, who's the current Secretary of State and the candidate for Secretary of State in Michigan, I think speaking about election deniers recently said something to the effect of voting for an election denier is like putting an arsonist in charge of the fire department. And I think she put it quite well.
Yeah, that is well said. Anything else that you feel is really notable for people to know in terms of like the gubernatorial, secretary of state, and attorney general candidates around the country? Because I do want to talk about state legislatures as well.
I mean, I think that as you can see that one of the most interesting things is that election denial has been a centerpiece of many of these people's candidacies. It's not just something that they kind of say and then move on from. It's something that many of these candidates are are persistent about and they talk about a lot, that tells you that this is something to be, I think, genuinely worried about. These are not people who are just ticking off a box.
Yeah. And lastly, on this topic, you mentioned at the start of our conversation that, it's not just county commissioners, it's people running on the ballot for Secretary of State, Governor, Attorney General. But what I'm also concerned about, and I'm wondering if you've heard any reports about this, efforts to recruit election deniers for polling booth jobs. That is going to be so, like, as poll workers, do you think that they're going to try to kind of infiltrate that part of the electoral process?
Right. So I think it is very clear that there is what Steve Bannon called a precinct by precinct strategy that they're employing, and that does involve having either observers or poll watchers in precincts or actual poll workers in the precincts. I think vis-a-vis the poll workers, while it's certainly not ideal to have those sort of people as officials at your precinct, it's important for every voter to know that there's never any one poll worker who can make a final decision that will significantly impact your ability to vote. So people should go into their precincts 100% confident that their vote is going to be counted and that there are multiple fail-safe mechanisms to make sure that their vote is counted. That being said, if any voter does go into a polling place and encounters either an observer or a poll worker who they think is behaving inappropriately or behaving in a partisan manner, they should call the election hotline, which is 1-866-OUR-VOTE. It's 1-866-OUR-VOTE. You should immediately report any incident about that. And that hotline, which runs nationwide, will immediately flag and run the incident up to all of the appropriate people so that that problem can be taken care of. So as worrying as what you described is, I think it's really important for every voter to feel confident, and they should feel confident that their vote will be counted and that there are multiple fail-safe systems for taking care of anyone who tries to misbehave at a polling place.
Good to know. Yes, and you have that hotline, people, if you need to report something. So let's now talk about these state legislatures and what is being proposed on that level. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear a case called Moore v. Harper, which is one of the most concerning cases, in my opinion, that they could rule on, and it could completely change the way that elections go, because it basically allows for state legislatures to have a lot more say in how those elections are structured. Can you talk about the threat of that case and just what the ramifications could be?
Yeah, so I'm actually pretty limited in what I can say about that case, and that's because my organization is representing one of the parties
okay.
in front of the Supreme Court. So, as much as I would like to be able to talk about it, I need to tell people that we're bound by an attorney-client relationship in terms of talking about it, and I would tell people just go read the papers, in this that have been filed in the Supreme Court. I'm so sorry, I can't talk more about it.
No, that's fine. I apologize. I didn't realize that was the case, but yes, and you can listen to our coverage on this as well, because we've been quite passionate and fearful about what any outcome could be on that front. But then let's just turn to some of these state legislatures and some of the bills that you're seeing being proposed and adopted on that level that could have deep ramifications for the electoral process.
Right. So this is the other thing that we saw. In as much as we've seen like a wave of people, election deniers going into this space, we've also seen this kind of weird, negative, hostile creativity regarding the law flow into the space. And we've seen, state legislatures initiate a tidal wave of new laws or prospective new laws that would rework and kind of introduce this level of hyperpartisanship and doubt into our election system. And that's highlighted in a report that we've done, which is called Democracy Crisis in the Making, where we've chronicled well over 200 bills that have been introduced just this year. And also if you add in 2021, it's even more pieces of legislation that have been introduced across more than 30 states. And each of these bills kind of would create or lay the groundwork legally for essentially chaos in our election system that would allow partisan legislatures or partisan election officials to essentially disregard the will of the voters. They do this through a variety of techniques. Like I said, it's this weird kind of hostile, anti-negative creativity. They keep coming up with new ideas and new ways to do things. But people probably remember at the beginning of 2021 when Georgia passed legislation that amongst other things, really significantly increased the ability of a board that is selected by the partisan state legislature to examine and kind of initiate hostile takeovers of boards of election that they don't like. And the county that immediately drew their gaze was Fulton County, which is the most Democratic and African American county in all of Georgia. So people probably remember that, but not just Georgia, there are a bunch of other states where they've been doing these sort of things. Everything from, now I should say, the number of bills that have passed has been, kind of in lower numbers than the number of bills that have been introduced.
That's good. Silver lining.
Silver lining. What we're going to be monitoring really carefully is after this election, when a lot of state legislatures are going to be, kind of elected, what we're going to be monitoring really carefully is whether or not there's a real change and whether or not they're going to have the kind of wind in their sails and begin enacting more and more pieces of legislation. But we've been seeing some things like bills that would require all ballots be hand counted, which is a like taking election administration back to the horse and buggy era. Right. And it's like it would introduce inaccuracy, partisanship. It would just introduce so many problems into our system to go back to hand counting ballots. As kind of nostalgic as it sounds, it's really not a good idea.
Well, and this is, it's so silly because this is a difference. It's completely different than electronic voting, where you can maybe, have some concerns. This is just electronic reading of paper ballots. And they're deliberately, I think, trying to obscure that fact. Yeah.
I think you put your finger on it, and I think that's so important, is that it's not everywhere, but almost everywhere, all voting is conducted on a piece of paper, and that piece of paper is maintained. And then it's like scanned into an electronic tabulator, and that's how the votes are counted. But if there's ever any sign of a problem, you go back to the paper and you recount it. Right. And almost every state, they do like before they use the tabulators, they do what's known as logic and accuracy testing every single time to make sure that the machines are properly programmed. And then after the election, they do audits to make sure that the machines properly counted the votes. And then if there's a recount, you pull out all of the paper ballots and you check it out. And, they're like, let's put it this way, since we started using these electronic tabulators, billions and billions of votes have been counted and tabulated and tested and retested and audited all over the place. And the number of errors are so tiny. Yeah. These machines they're good, and we check so much to make sure that they're good. And the hand counting is slow, and it is also very, very inaccurate. I think there have been some studies that have shown that hand counted tabulations are off by anywhere from 1% to 2%. And given that a lot of races are less than 1% or less than 2%, you're looking at some real errors if we go back to hand counting.
Yeah, again, hey, I mean, they were also complaining that the election results were taking too long and how scary that would be. I mean, hand counting ballots, give me a break. You can do that as a back measure, but as the initial process, it's ridiculous. Yeah. So Can you also talk a little bit about some of the efforts to restrict and encumber mail-in voting?
Yeah, so that has been one of the most persistent lanes of attack against our current voting system, and it's happened everywhere. It's been by legislation and it's been by litigation. For example, Delaware just recently passed a piece of legislation that would, for the first time ever in the state's history, allowed no excuse mail-in balloting. It was immediately challenged in court. They took it all the way up to the Delaware Supreme Court, and the Delaware Supreme Court actually struck down the law in Delaware. So no excuse mail-in balloting there. In Arizona, for the longest time, they had what's known as the permanent early voting list. And that was a process where a voter could say, you know what, I just want to always receive a mail-in ballot. I'm going to be a permanent kind of mail-in sort of ballot person. And the Arizona state legislature passed legislation that got rid of the permanent early voting system. Then you've seen in Pennsylvania, which also in 2019 implemented, no excuse mail-in voting systems. You've seen multiple lawsuits trying to strike it down, as well as multiple pieces of legislation attempting to get rid of mail-in voting. And it's because, meanwhile, of course, you've got states like Utah and Washington that have been using almost all mail-in voting for decades without any fraud or without any sort of problems. So in a lot of states, you've seen really concerted efforts to get rid of or hobble mail-in voting. And then on top of just getting rid of it, you're seeing very concerted efforts to kind of micro-examine every single piece of mail-in voting for any kind of minor discrepancy or any failure to perfectly fill out every last little bit of the ballot. And then if there's even a minor or technical deficiency in the ballot, there's an effort to throw it out.
Signature verification is one of those methods.
Yeah, signature verification. Another one is like, sometimes people, like if you're supposed to fill in your address, sometimes people will just put in the zip code, or they'll, they'll forget to put the state in or something like that. There are all sorts of things that people do to kind of shorthand. I mean, I do it all the time. Like when if I'm sending a letter, sometimes I just put in my zip code instead of the whole, city or something like that. And so they're going after people on that sort of stuff. All of which is by way of saying that if any of your listeners are voting by absentee or mail-in ballot, to follow the directions perfectly. Yeah.
Oh, and just your mic's hidden your shirt just a little bit.
Sorry.
I just wanted to. No, it's okay.
Yeah.
So can you talk more specifically? And when you say going after people, I was just reminded of what we saw in Florida, where this is a little bit of an aside, but I couldn't, have an election expert on and not talk about the way that Ron DeSantis and his government has been targeting and kind of trying to almost intentionally trick people who have felonies in the past. And there's a very small sliver of people who, after that measure was passed, I think it was a ballot initiative in Florida, that cannot vote, and they made it very vague to, I think, send a message to anybody who might be qualified under this new designation that you might not actually be sure about your status, so you could be put in handcuffs and then have to deal with this situation and being arrested if you do try to vote. I mean, what do you make of the display of force from Ron DeSantis in Florida?
Well, I think you put your finger on it. It's a display of force rather than a real, I think, honest effort to ensure integrity in our election system from what I know, and of course, facts always emerge. So at least I'm speaking about the facts as I know them right now. The people who were arrested made genuine mistakes, and they weren't trying to cheat or defraud the system. They certainly weren't doing anything that's kind of at the level of what you and I might consider a crime, that really significantly injures people. These were people who made good faith mistakes. And I think they've been hauled out in handcuffs to send a message to people. And I really hope they get good criminal defense attorneys.
Yeah. Lastly, are there any states in particular that we should be keeping our eyes on for some of these state legislature efforts? Like, which states are kind of red flashing light, no pun intended, for things that people should be paying attention to next week?
Well, as you noted, Arizona is one of those states that has been kind of at the epicenter of much of the election denier movement and at the epicenter of the kind of the legislative efforts to kind of alter the way we run our elections. So has Texas. And so far, in a lot of states, we've seen some of the worst efforts get pushed back. And those states include places like, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and even Louisiana. So I would be watching those states in the coming year to see what happens.
All right. Well, Victoria Bassetti, Senior Advisor of States United Action, author of Electoral Dysfunction, a Survival Manual for American Voters. Thanks so much for your time today. I know this is probably a very busy time for you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I really appreciate it too. And everyone go vote.
Yes, please. Thanks so much.
Thanks.